Hi guys, I just want to start a new series today, and this is to encourage you. This is based from chapter 11 of Crushing Conceptualism, and the title of this chapter is called "In the Face of Scrutiny," and it deals with a lot of what we might face when we begin discussing a lot of the fringe topics in Christianity, a lot of the things that people just want to ignore. And so I just wanted to start out by reading something that a friend wrote. And I had asked her, Ginger Crawford, I asked her if I could use what she wrote to open this chapter. And here's what she had to say. She said, those of us who stand firm on truth, who don't bend on our stance just to please others, who speak boldly about things that matter, who work hard to drop knowledge that might open your eyes, we don't do it because we have anything to gain. What we get is ridicule, mocking, and threats of violence. Even though you laugh at us, gossip about us, belittle our intelligence, and smear our name, we still think you matter. We see what you don't. We see the pitfalls before you because we've been trapped by the same pitfalls before. But praise the Lord that our eyes have been opened. We pray that yours are opened soon too. From the tainted food, the chemical-laden air that we breathe, TV shows casting spells on you, immorality, poisons and vaccines, Luciferian preachers of the New Age, the prosperity gospels, yoga, NASA, Catholicism, the secular music industry, Hollywood, MK Ultra, SRA. The list goes on. And she just lists a handful of those topics too. We see what you don't. We see it devouring you, and we long for you to wake up. And so we fight. And I just thought that was really good. And that's what this chapter talks about, is kind of the treatment that we might face. And it's not every day that you realize that your reality is based on a sequence of lies. And a lot of people who are a part of what has been called the truther movement in different communities, it might be a Christian community, but a lot, that term truther has kind of made has kind of been a way of labeling a lot of people who look into these fringe topics. But depending on your response to these subjects, you may feel compelled to make others aware of this information too. I know I do. And it's like, perhaps you could be an ark builder in the lives of others, preparing them for what's to come. But if so, then that's the purpose of this video. I just want to caution you. I want to forewarn you of the criticism that you will face. The ministry, and I explained in another video that the ministry of an ark builder, it's what I call my ministry, ark builders, and it's basically a way of preparing God's people, for what's to come. But it doesn't go without a fight. You're going to be stripped of your reputation, and you're going to lose friends. You will be targeted, ridiculed, and you're going to be hated for his name's sake, as the scriptures say. So that's why I felt it necessary to add this chapter and to do these videos to equip you for everything that might lie ahead. Peter says in the 3rd chapter of his first epistle, he says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Okay, I'm going to do it as really it's going to be transparent. I mean, I'm going to do it with as much respect as I can have about about the way that, some of the things that I've experienced, but coming out of Babylon, it's a continual process, like any other aspect of life. It occurs in phases. You might, some days you'll experience spiritual breakthroughs, and other days you might not. But to everything there is a season. So even though a lot of the content in my book, it accumulated over the past decade, but it's really been the past few years, starting in 2017, that turned out to be a major shift in my journey. It was over a course of the past few years that I came out of the institutional church system, and I can't say whether you'll experience the same conflict as I did. After all, the organization that I was a part of, it's one of the more extreme establishments in terms of indoctrination and cultic behavior. So, but the challenges are no less of a reality despite your position or background. So those that are still under the clutches of indoctrination, they'll try to convince you that you are the one who is deceived because you may display certain behaviors or characteristics. Okay, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Even though some of the details may vary, it is inevitable. You will face some of the following denunciations. A guy, Jason Hairston, whoever that may be, I loved his quote. He says, "Being considered crazy by those who are still victims of cultural conditioning is a compliment." So the first section I wanted to cover in this short series of videos is titled Spiritual Elitism, Self-Appointed Prophets. And the denunciation, I start every section in this chapter with a denunciation. Those who are indoctrinated or bound by tradition may label you as an elitist or a self-appointed prophet, suggesting that you are flattering yourself in your own eyes. They're using that scripture against you, as the psalmist wrote. From their perspective, you claim to know more than everyone else, and that your interpretation and pursuit of truth is much deeper than theirs. So to them, you appear to be the one who is deceived. All right. And this section is somewhat of an extension of chapter 10 in the formal organization section. So first, we got to understand that certain individuals do possess more knowledge and insight than others. This is a reality. It's an attribute of biblical prophets. And so just because some have acquired further insight than others, it doesn't mean that person is an elitist. It only demonstrates that he's a truth seeker, and that his message is going to be rejected by those who value tradition more than truth. So categorically, elitism is when a group or individual cannot be corrected. That's what elitism is. When you're not teachable. Traditionalists or conformists, they typically claim to be teachers while they are irrationally unteachable themselves. And this behavior, it was observed during the first century when the writer of Hebrews said, for the time ye ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. So take it from someone who was once a member of an elitist group. I was a part of a group who claims to be the true church, and that all denominations are false except for their denomination. So I previously displayed the same characteristics. My former theological community, they would call every other church who is not a part of their belief system a false church. In fact, the purpose of my previous book, When I started seeing things, when I wrote this was, it was a book I wrote to challenge one specific aspect of theology that I noticed they were in error about. It was to challenge the elite behavior that I recognized in the organization that I was a part of. And so in the responses I received about that, they were decisively one-sided. I presented questions they couldn't answer, but they gave me answers that I wasn't supposed to question, if that makes sense. So publishing a book that challenged my own belief system, this demonstrates that I'm not spiritually elite. It displays that I was able to identify an elitist community and come out from among them. So in short, I made the decision to be teachable. And that's what a lot of people today in this truther community, that's one characteristic that I can commend people for. It's, they want to be teachable. They want to identify flaws in their theology. So that's why the circumstances are ironic. Those who are willing to lay everything down, everything that they've ever believed, and reevaluate their entire mental library. Okay, it's one of the most noble decisions that a person could make. It's one of the humblest, and it's a selfless decision, and it basically it shows that you don't care about status quo, and it displays a teachable attitude, and it verifies that an individual is not concerned about personal agenda, but quite the opposite. They've made themselves available to build an ark. Okay, so when others accuse God's messengers of elitism, it generally comes from those who display elitism themselves, and such was the case in the organization that I was a part of. Now coming out of it and looking back, it's evident that they were one of the more extreme elitists of any group that I've ever seen in the Christian community. So, or the Christian mainstream, rather. So I guess to accuse others of elitism is nothing more than a defense mechanism. Essentially, all the topics that we're going to be discussing in this series, they are defense mechanisms. They're accusations or denunciations targeted at people who pose a threat to their system. So it's basically, and I talked about this in chapter 1. It was the introduction, talking about the psychology. We tend to respond to new information instinctively, according to how it lines up with our current beliefs. And when it doesn't align, it raises feelings of defensiveness. It's a psychological condition and it's been a recurrent theme throughout this entire book, throughout all the pages. Cognitive dissonance, and it occurs when the individual is faced with inconvenient information that challenges his beliefs. Depending on how that information is received, how it's processed, and how they respond to it, it essentially reveals the level of elitism in the group or individual. And the Apostle Paul, he warned the church about this. And I refer to it as egotism. And Paul warned the church about this. In Romans 12:3, he said, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each one of you." So the issue isn't whether we believe our role is superior to all others, okay? It's whether we can admit when we are in error. An elitist will focus on his superiority and he will use his position to validate his unbending beliefs. While a diligent student is open to what he can do to correct in his theology. And this entire book, all these series that I'm coming out with, Crushing Conceptualism in Modern Christianity. This book wouldn't have even been possible if I had not been willing to admit that I was wrong in several occasions. The only reason that I was able to produce the content was because I made that conscious decision to not be an elitist. Okay? So just because someone shares new information, it doesn't mean he is an elitist. It really, ironically, and to the contrary, it demonstrates quite the opposite, that he's humble enough to remain teachable. It displays that he was willing to consider that he may have been wrong before. So true elitists are those who continue to operate under familiar doctrinal positions without any intent on acquiring any further insight. That is what I came out of. They taught that that you are that you have basically arrived in full revelation of truth. Their denomination has the truth, all others do not. And that's true elitism. When you continue to operate under that familiar position and you don't plan on making any changes or correcting your theology. It's basically, elitism is the refusal of information that might cause you to change your core theological beliefs, regardless of whether it's true or not. And it reminded me of when I wrote this of an email that I received. It was a reply. I was in conversation with an old friend in the commercial setting. He was a part of the institutional church system that I talked about in another series. And as much as I tried to share certain information with him, his response every time, it always seemed to be the same. He would say, and I copied and pasted this from his email. He would say, quote, "I do not need your direction or guidance. We are seeing lives changed and our church is growing." So without going into detail, I'll simply say that I've attempted to share certain nuggets of information with this guy in hopes that he would truly consider the details instead of judging by his current position, his beliefs, and his organizational influence. But his replies always seemed to point back to what he has accomplished by using the deck of cards that was dealt with him as a child. You know what I mean? It's unfortunate that so many traditionalists will pat themselves on the back for growing in numbers, and while refusing to purge themselves of the traditional influence, and all because they're following what has always worked. It's just kind of disappointing, really. Excuse me. For if any of you out there, if you've experienced a broader scope of revelation than what is commonly advertised among Christianity, if you've observed any of these things that I discuss in my book, any of these topics that are just taboo in the Christian community, prepare yourself if you're going to be vocal about it, because rejection it's inevitable. But don't allow these traditionalists to convince you that your character has changed. It's not a matter of being arrogant or seeking a label such as a prophet or a prophetess. Those that I would consider prophets in the modern age, or ark builders. I like to use that phrase, ark builders, just because it describes a people preparing others. Okay, preparing for something that's to come. And I like using ark builders because I really see it as a way for us to prepare others to be saved from all of this, to at least be aware of what's about to happen. But those that I would consider modern prophets or modern ark builders, they're very humble from what I've been able to gather from some people. They've been willing to endure a life of ridicule from a lot of the things that they're coming out with. It's not like any of us just woke up one day and we wished all this criticism on ourselves from everybody that we know. None of us have. All right. We're all human. We all have feelings, no different than anyone else. I want to be respected. We all want to be respected. We value the opinions of others. Okay. But we can't afford to base our decisions on the response of others and what we want. If this were the case, then Christ would have never approached the Pharisees. His ministry, it came at the expense of his reputation. And so does ours. If we're going to be real about it, biblically speaking, a prophet is more often rejected than accepted or identified as a prophet. Like Christ said in Luke 4:24, and he said, no prophet is accepted in his own country. So it's not an attempt to place the role of a prophet on a pedestal or to place ourselves in a position where we should be thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to, because that wasn't the case with Christ. He had information that others needed. He wasn't arrogant about it, and he didn't try to label himself as something other than what he really was, But really, if you think about it, this is what institutional churches are doing in the commercial setting. They have made the role of a prophet unattainable to the average believer. But in biblical times, God basically sought those who were unorthodox, those who weren't commonly accepted. John the Baptist, for crying out loud, he was a pretty peculiar individual. He was a social oddity. According to the biblical profile, prophets don't readily adhere to the formal traditions of the institutional establishments. Okay, but today it seems more like mainstream Christianity only accepts those who do and identifies those as prophets. And like I said in one of my last videos, they'll invite prophets, people that they have labeled as prophets, people that they have licensed. They will invite them and pay them, schedule them into the availability of the church calendar, and invite them to come speak and give their church a word of prophecy that they reaffirm that they are succeeding and that they're about to experience revival. I've been a part of all that. Okay, but the moment that God sends someone to wake somebody up or give them a piece of information that isn't convenient to their vision, suddenly they will, they'll disregard anything, whether that information is true or not, because it doesn't fit in their agenda. Okay. The fact that traditional establishments consciously label their ministers as prophets, it demonstrates that they do believe God does grant privileged insight to certain individuals. So, even though, but really the question is why they believe prophets can be appointed on their terms and under their licensing. So if that makes sense, according to the biblical model, prophets, that doesn't fit the description. Prophets were sent on God's terms. He never allowed the people themselves determine who their prophets were. It was never about the people's decision. So when I'm accused of being a self-appointed prophet, I first consider that it comes from those who have already appointed prophets on their own terms, who ignore the biblical definition and description of a prophet. People who pay their prophets to speak prosperity messages to motivate their congregations. And Paul warned Timothy about this in his second epistle, chapter 4. Okay, he said the time will come when they will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. So even though I'm hesitant to use that term prophet, due to so many misconceptions, everybody has their own ideas. The role of a prophet is legitimate. And today, there are many individuals who have reestablished what was believed for millennia. God, he always has a way of using prophets to bring people back to square one. And they were used to persuade the people that it was time to regroup. So in 2 Chronicles, chapter 24, verse 19, it says, although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to him, and though they testified against them, they would not listen. So evidently the tendency to reject prophets in those days, it's no different than it is today. And it's basically a long line of stubbornness. And that's what Paul had in mind when he was writing about future churches having itching ears and raising up false teachers. So if your eyes have been open to some of these topics that I write about or that I'm talking about, and you feel significant because of what God has revealed to you, then you should feel significant. You are significant. If you feel called to wake up the others about certain areas of deception, then it could be that you're called to be a prophet to those who are still asleep. All right? Don't be intimidated by the potential calling of a prophet. If you're intimidated by it, then it's probably because the conceptual image that modern Christian, that modern churches, basically it's their definition. When you identify a true prophet, in contrast to those that I call showcase prophets, there are very visible signs. And I can list these. I can put them up on the screen. Probably I'll just put them maybe in the description of the video. True prophets deliver controversial messages, while showcase prophets tickle the ears of their hearers. Okay? Next bullet. True prophets are generally rejected, while showcase prophets are invited, welcomed, and paid for their time. All right? True prophets are unorthodox. They're often quirky, nonconformists, while showcase prophets adhere to the formal institutional profile, and they obtain legal certification provided by their corporate establishments. True prophets, they are often reluctant to deliver certain messages because of the controversial nature, while showcase prophets are eager to dress up in fancy clothes and deliver messages of prosperity while gaining recognition. I've seen it. I'm not bashing. I've seen it. True prophets resemble figures such as John the Baptist, while showcase prophets resemble the spiritually elite Pharisees who rejected the message of Christ. And then lastly, true prophets are appointed by God, while showcase prophets appoint themselves or are appointed by the organizations that certify their chosen within the organizational licensing. So in sum, if you find that you've been labeled an elitist or a self-appointed prophet, then you can find comfort knowing that it's likely coming from those who are already or are spiritually elite themselves. Okay, it's what I call reverse accusation. Okay, it's when the deceived accuse others of being deceived. It's when the spiritually elite accuse others of elitism. And it's basically a form of psychological projection. And it's when the human ego defends itself against certain qualities by denying those qualities within themselves. So in turn, they basically attribute those qualities to others. And you'll find this to be a recurrent condition among your accusers. And as we go forward in these videos, traditionalists, basically, this is kind of my closing statement, is that basically traditionalists who reject modern ark builders are focused on what is convenient to their own compartmentalized community and something that they have built. So if they reject you, they're only doing it to protect their establishment. They don't want change, and they don't intend on growing any further than because they already believe they have arrived at the final place of enlightenment or information or insight or biblical clarity. So I hope you found comfort in this video. It's just what I've dealt with. It's just what I've seen, what I've observed. And so I hope it really encourages you maybe to step out in faith and continue being that ark builder that others need. So thank you for listening, and I'll start with the next video.